I go down the spiral staircase, and there on one of the runs of the stair is the 3-page ransom note.
And no one has entered the house, the door isn't open, you read the note.
I don't know that.
What did you do? Oh, yeah.
Well, I hurriedly read it, and didn't take long to understand what was happening.
Now have a look at the dramatization of how the officer gets the ransom note, and look out for the moment where Patsy or John hands the officer the note. How does the note end up in the officer's hands?
And then I came downstairs, and that's when I saw it. It was here. It was right here.
Shouldn't you close the airports? What about roadblocks? What do you do first?
One moment, sir. Is this where you found it, ma'am?
No.
So when the officer comes in, where does he find the note? Does he find the note side by side on the stair, or does he find it somewhere else?
No, I found it right here on the stairs. Is it 8 yet? They said they were going to call between 8 and 10. What time is it?
Honey, it's only a bit after 6. After you found this, what did you do?
Now, wouldn't you imagine that either of the Ramseys hands the officer the ransom note as he enters? Instead, they usher him into the room so that he basically puts his fingerprints on the note, assuming he wasn't wearing gloves. And if you look closely in the dramatization, he seems to reach for a glove as he's about to pick up the note. Do you notice that?
Detectives concluded the ransom note was written on pages torn out of Patsy's notepad.
Also, examination of that pad showed that somebody had started a ransom note one time and then abandoned it.
Did the kidnapper write a practice note?
And we've just now gotten a look at these documents, learning that the grand jury did indeed believe John and Patsy Ramsey had some responsibility in their daughter's death. What's interesting, though, is that the grand jury doesn't necessarily say they believe John and Patsy Ramsey committed the murder themselves.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't breathe. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. In this analysis, we're going to deal with the one handwriting expert for the prosecution who did testify for the grand jury. But this is not going to be the last episode on the witness, the one expert that the Boulder DA allowed to testify. We're going to do one more analysis on somebody else. Do you have any idea who that person could be? Bear that in mind as we go through this. And I want to ask you a question before we even deal with that analysis. Do you think, as we go through Chet Ubowski's contribution, do you think if you were on the grand jury, you would be convinced that, and this is bearing in mind that you're not really hearing the other experts. I think there were 5 handwriting experts for the defense, all saying that Patsy didn't write the note. Do you think if you heard Chet Ubowski's testimony that would convince you that Patsy wrote the ransom note? Now, bearing in mind, you're not hearing Professor Foster's testimony, you're not hearing Sina Wong's testimony. All you're hearing is Chet Ubowski versus 5 of the defense experts. Is Ubowski's testimony going to be sufficient to convince you? You've got to imagine you don't know anything else about this case. And I want you to think about that as we go through this analysis. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, I got quite an interesting question where someone said, I'm on my mobile phone, where is the thanks button? And it is a little bit more complicated on mobile. You'll notice if you scroll to the video you want to watch, you've got to scroll slightly to the right to find the thanks button. It's kind of a heart shape and it's got a $sign in it. When we say, please hit the thanks button, that's the button we're referring to. It's where we're asking, can you make a contribution, expressing your gratitude for our efforts, and we'd really appreciate it if you did. So if you've never done so, now you know where it is. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button and let's get started. First of all, let's have a look at what Steve Thomas writes on page 74 of his book, JonBenet, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation. What the CBI examiner told them very privately, this is Chet Ubowski, was astounding. 24 of the alphabet's 26 letters looked as if they had been written by Patsy. When taken together, the tablet, the Sharpie pen, and the writing formed a powerful base of evidence, and that evidence pointed directly to Patsy Ramsey. Now, bear in mind, Detective Steve Thomas's opinion was firmly fixed on Patsy. He felt that Patsy had killed JonBenet, which not even the grand jury, as you've heard, felt that way either, and I agree with that assessment that Patsy didn't kill her daughter. And I suspect Steve Thomas based his assessment in part on his certainty that Patsy wrote the ransom note, but also this idea that whoever wrote the ransom note killed JonBenet. I also think a lot of what he thought was based on the housekeeper being convinced about the same thing. Anyway, let's go to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Yubowski concluded that there is evidence which indicates that the ransom note may have been written by Patsy Ramsey. Now imagine if you were on the grand jury and you heard him say those words. There's evidence that indicates the ransom note may have been written by Patsy Ramsey. Would that be convincing to you? To be more certain, however, Yubowski needed more samples produced before December 26th, samples that wouldn't contain any elements of distortion, attempts to disguise handwriting, or nervousness. So what is that really referring to? Elements of distortion, attempts to disguise, or nervousness? Well, that is all the handwriting samples that came out after the December 26th. So he's looking for original samples where they don't really ask Patsy to volunteer any writing, just looking at her original samples. And so, as we know, when Detective Harmer searched the Ramsey Charlevoix home in January, she noticed several handwritten items. Now, do you notice something that's quite strange here? That there's several handwritten items in the Charlevoix home, but not apparently in the Ramsey home. What's up with that? Now, with Yubowski's report in hand, the court granted a second search warrant. On March 5th, Harmer left for Michigan. It took her only an hour and 15 minutes to collect 13 handwritten recipe cards, an address book with handwriting in it, 2 small legal pads with handwriting in it, 3 notes from a kitchen corkboard, and a photo album with printing. So it wasn't very hard to find all of these samples of handwriting. Now, Yubowski's position was ultimately sort of iffy. He seemed to concede the possibility that Patsy Ramsey couldn't be excluded as the author. But if you think about it, that's a fairly weak position, which is why perhaps Boulder PD wanted to rely more heavily on someone else, someone who could take a stronger position, like Professor Foster or Sina Wong. And that was, as I understand it, the dilemma they were in. The Ramsey experts who actually trained the CBI, they said it was very unlikely, 4.5 out of 5, that Patsy wrote the note. Did Yubowski, who was from the CBI, really want to contradict his former masters? And far from the Ramsey case being underserviced, it often feels like it suffered from the opposite problem, that there were too many experts, too many talking heads, too many experts with differing opinions. Let's go back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, just to get this idea of too many cooks spoiling the broth, right? The police had arranged their voluminous files, photographs, and visual displays in the first few rows of the center section. Behind those seats, Barry Scheck and Henry Lee sat next to each other. Behind them were Alex Hunter and Bill Wise. In the top row, sitting alone, was Pete Hofstrom. To the left of Hunter's group, Trip DeMuth, Deputy DAs Pete McGuire, Bill Nagel, John Pickering, and Mary Keenan. Beside them, Tom Haney, Michael Caine, Lou Smith, and Dan Schiller, and John Daly and Terry Gillespie from the Colorado Attorney General's office. Also present were 4 Boulder police commanders who had applied for the position of Director of Police Services: Molly Bernard, Jim Hughes, Tom Kilpatrick, and Dave Hayes. Bill Hagmeyer, Mike Morrow, and Larry Ankrum from the FBI's Child Abduction Unit and Serial Killer Unit were also there. So here you've got the FBI once again being present at some of the important meetings where they're going to make decisions. There was also CBI personnel, including Pete Mang, Kathy Dressel, and Chet Yubowski. In front was a podium equipped with a microphone, and behind it a large screen. The room was stifling. The air conditioning wasn't working. The Boulder PD wanted to make sure that Hunter would take the case to a grand jury. If you go back and count the names that I've mentioned there, it's about 27 people. And you want to tell me, there was insufficient information, there were insufficient resources, there was insufficient experience in the police. The police botched this case at the police level. Please show me any other case that had this level of resources dedicated to it, including the FBI present in a sort of consulting role. Let's go back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Knowing that the ransom note was the best piece of evidence they had, Hunter hoped that the CBI's handwriting experts, that's Chetubowski, would find something solid. However, Chetubowski would not take the leap and say that Patsy had written the note. So he's the guy who ultimately testified before the grand jury, and he's the guy who will not take the leap and say that Patsy had written the note. And the narrative goes on to say the CBI expert refused to tailor his evidence, blah, blah, blah. So there seems to be some issue with this expert, that he does have the right credentials, but he doesn't seem to want to condemn the Ramseys. And this expert happens to be the one, of course, that the DA, Alex Hunter, gives his consent to testify. Let's go back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. By October 27, 1998, the grand jury had been sitting for 5 weeks, had met 10 times, and had taken one 10-day break. Coroner John May and experts from the CBI presented their evaluations of the evidence, including Chetubowski, the handwriting expert, who had reported to the police that Patsy could not be excluded as the writer of the ransom note. That's his testimony. We can't exclude her. Would that be strong enough evidence if you were sitting on the grand jury to convince you that Patsy wrote the ransom note? Well, it wouldn't convince me if it was just that. There's also this postscript in this little section. He had also told, this is Chetubowski, had also told Pete Mang, his boss at the CBI, that his gut told him it was her handwriting. Is that going to be enough for you? So imagine you on the jury and an expert takes the stand and he says, guys, my gut feel tells me we can't exclude this person. It's not a very strong position, is it? My understanding is that over time, Chetubowski became more willing to express more confidence in his position. I could be wrong. Let's go back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. The ransom note into his report and whether it was his final report. Either way, Chetubowski was prepared to say Patsy wrote the note. The CBI saw this as one more example of the missed opportunities in the investigation. But if you look carefully, if you look closely, if you read between the lines, there does seem to be initial hesitation, which then leads to a weird quandary in terms of their effort to get an accredited dude to sound a bit more confident. And so they found an expert who ended up even less conclusive than Chetubowski's lukewarm assessment. This is also from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Chetubowski, the CBI's handwriting expert, learned from Detective Trujillo, did I pronounce that right, that Beckner had requested and the DA's office had authorized another handwriting analysis of the ransom note, basically with another expert. Hofstrom and the police had looked for an expert who would testify that Patsy had written the note. Why? Because it seems like Chetubowski wouldn't say that. He'd say he can't exclude Patsy, but they're looking for someone who would say Patsy wrote the note. And so they turned to the U.S. Secret Service and got an opinion less conclusive even than Chetubowski's. The upshot of that for the defense was that the CBI's conclusions were now compromised. You've got two experts contradicting each other in terms of the prosecution case. And that's where we come back to this question. So Professor Foster's out of the equation. Sina Wong out of the equation. Chetubowski testifies, but is he particularly convincing? And so then the question arises, first of all, do you think the grand jury were ultimately convinced that Patsy wrote the note? If they were, who or what convinced them? Do you think it was Chetubowski? I don't think so. Because it seems like the people that the district attorney's office basically wanted to testify on this particular topic were contradicting themselves and wasn't very strong evidence. And as a result of that, the Ramseys would have the right to use the second analysis. In effect, the Ramseys could actually use the prosecution's case against the prosecution. This is clearly speculation. You might say, I think you're wrong about this. I don't think that is the right conclusion to draw. I think what this shows is the possibility, indeed the probability, that the Boulder grand jury weren't swayed one way or the other by the prosecution's not terribly convincing handwriting expert. But neither were they swayed, in my opinion, by Team Ramsey's defense experts. Otherwise, why would they have voted the way they voted? And yet I do think they ultimately suspected Patsy wrote the note. Otherwise, they wouldn't have voted for that accessory true bill, right? But how did that happen? Who testified in some perhaps unprofessional way, not as an expert, but just as a lay person? And then that led to the grand jury thinking the way they did. Who could that person be? And it is an open question in terms of this count. Is it count 7? What is actually being alluded to there? Is it something to do with the ransom note or something else? I mean, do you think the ransom note could have performed the role of delaying the discovery of something or someone, or hindering the discovery of something or someone, or preventing the discovery of something or someone? Do you think that's a reference to the ransom note, possibly? So I want to ask you a question, and I don't think it's really been asked, let alone thought about. If the grand jury basically got nothing from these handwriting experts, if we assume that that's the case, and I think the whole handwriting expert thing is so snakes and laddery, it seems an expert can bend their expertise subjectively either way. But if they didn't convince the grand jury who wrote the ransom note, who did? And we'll deal with the answer to that hypothetical in the next episode. Now, before we conclude, 2 more things we ought to consider. Have a look at this excerpt from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Jeff Shapiro said he asked Hunter what time the ransom note said the ransom was supposed to be picked up. And apparently Hunter answered, let me check. Where's my copy of the note? Shapiro thought that Hunter was teasing him. Hunter told me there was to be a call between 8 and 10 a.m. No one outside of the investigation had been told that at the time. Can I just see what the handwriting looks like? Shapiro asked. Then Hunter opened a spiral binder, took out some loose pages, and held them up real close to Shapiro's eyes, so close that Shapiro couldn't read anything. Then Hunter quickly pulled the pages back, put them away, and went, "Ha ha ha, don't tell anyone I did that," Hunter said. "Okay." And that's when Shapiro said, that's when I got the feeling Hunter must know deep down more than what he's, I guess, revealing. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is a legal issue, a very serious legal issue, a legal hurdle the prosecution needed to overcome in order to make their case. This is also from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. To say that Patsy hadn't been excluded as the author of the note was only soft evidence, as Hunter called it, and it might not be enough to charge Patsy as an accessory. Why? The DA believed that under Colorado law, an accessory could be charged only when a principal was charged. So in other words, you needed to have the perpetrator in order to charge the accessory. And did they have a perpetrator? Does that make sense? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.